If you ever have trouble identifying conclusions on the LSAT accurately, then you might be making the mistake that I describe in this video. So you probably know that one useful test for distinguishing conclusions from supporting statements is the why test, or the why because test. Now how this is supposed to work is, if you're stuck between two statements as a conclusion and not sure which one is the actual conclusion, then you can take one of those statements, ask why, and then say because the other statement. Then you can switch it up. Take the second statement, ask why, because the first statement. Now one of those statements should make more sense following the word because. That one would be a reason, that one would be a supporting statement and not the conclusion. The other statement will fit more as the statement we're asking why about, and that one would be the conclusion. But there are some kinds of arguments for which this why test can seem to fail, at least for some students. And it's because there's actually two different senses of the question why, and one of them can be misleading. When you ask the question why, one meaning that you might have in mind is, why is this statement true? Or in other words, what explains why this statement is true? Why is the sky blue? Why do bad things happen to good people? That's the sense of why that you might have in mind, an attempt to explain something that happens in the world. The other meaning that you might have when you ask the question why is, why should I believe this statement? How do I even know that it's true? What should make me think that this statement is true? Now, in many arguments, it doesn't really matter which meaning of why you have in mind. Asking this question can still help you see what's the conclusion. But occasionally you run into arguments where you actually have to have the second meaning in mind in order for the why test to work effectively. Let's look at an example. So if you just read this argument and think, what is the author trying to convince me of, you probably identify the second statement here as the conclusion, and that would be correct. But let's see what happens if you apply the why test using the meaning, why is this statement true? In the last 10 years, the Golden State Warriors have won the most championships in the NBA. Why is this true? Because they are the best team in the NBA. That actually seems to make a little bit of sense to me. Their being the best team does seem to give you a reason for why they won the most NBA championships. Why have they won the most NBA championships? Because they're the best team in the league. Let's switch the order of the statements now. The Golden State Warriors are the best team in the NBA. Why is this true? Because in the last 10 years, they've won the most championships. So I think this version makes a little bit more sense, but I don't like the fact that the other way of presenting the statements also seems to make almost as much sense when using this why test. If the claim that the Warriors are the best team in the NBA is supposed to be the conclusion, and it is, then why does it seem to also fit as a supporting statement when we're using this why test? Why does it seem like the claim that they're the best is almost like a reason for why they won the most championships? It's because we're asking the wrong question. Instead of asking why is this true, what explains why this is true, we should be asking, why should I believe this? What should make me think that this is true? Let's try this out. In the last 10 years, the Golden State Warriors have won the most NBA championships. Why should I believe this? What should make me think that this is true? Because they are the best team in the NBA. That doesn't quite fit that well, because being the best team isn't a good reason for how you would know that they won the most championships. If you're trying to prove that they won the most championships, then we would expect to get supporting statements regarding the number of championships they won compared to other teams. Saying that they're the best doesn't help prove some historical claim that they won more championships than other teams. Let's switch the order of the statements. The Golden State Warriors are the best team in the NBA. Why should I believe this? What should make me think this is true? Because in the last 10 years, they've won the most NBA championships. Now I think that's a great fit because it makes sense to point to their championships to help show that they're the best team. The number of championships they've won compared to other teams makes good evidence as far as why they're the best. And that helps us see that the second statement here is indeed the conclusion. So I hope you can see how in this argument, if you don't have the right meaning of why in your mind, you might be led astray, or at least it may be more difficult than it should be in figuring out why the second statement is the conclusion. Let's look at one more example of how the correct sense of the question why can make a big difference in properly identifying conclusions. So in this set of statements, the second sentence here is the conclusion, and it's being supported by the last statement. The author of this argument is trying to convince us that the reason Jeremy is staying in the classroom and asking questions is because he wants to ask the professor for a recommendation. And the premise supporting that is we know he's applying to grad school in the fall, and most grad schools require recommendations. The first claim here is neither a premise nor a conclusion. It's just a fact that we know about Jeremy that the author is trying to explain. The argument's about why he's doing the thing that this first sentence is describing. So that's the proper structure for this argument. But in my experience, a lot of beginners to the LSAT have trouble seeing this structure, and they might think that the first statement could be the conclusion. And then at this point, if they apply the why test imprecisely, they're going to be misled. For example, if you say, Jeremy stays in this classroom and asks questions to the professor after every single lecture. Why is this true? This is probably because he wants to ask the professor for a recommendation. Now that seems to have a logical flow to it, doesn't it? And it might make you think that the first sentence is a conclusion being supported by the second sentence. The idea that he wants to ask a professor for a recommendation seems to be the because that explains why he's staying in the classroom. But let's try it again using the correct understanding of why. Jeremy stays in the classroom and asks questions to the professor after every single lecture. Why should I believe this? How do I know that this is true? This is probably because he wants to ask the professor for a recommendation. Now this shouldn't make that much sense because the second statement here, when it uses the word this, that's a reference to the fact that he stays after class and asks questions. It's a reference to the entire first statement. So the second statement is already based on the first statement being true. How could the claim that he stays after class because he wants to ask the professor for a recommendation be offered to prove the fact that he stays after class in the first place? That doesn't make sense, and that's one way that you can tell that the first statement here is not a conclusion being supported by the second statement. Now let's try the why test on the second statement. The reason that Jeremy stays in the classroom and asks questions to the professor after every lecture is probably because he wants to ask the professor for a recommendation. Why should I believe this? What should make me think this is true? Because he's applying to grad school in the fall, and most grad schools require recommendations. Now I think that makes more sense. The last statement here is telling us why it makes sense to think Jeremy's staying after class in order to get a recommendation. Here's why we think he's trying to get a recommendation. He's going to grad school and they require recommendations. So that helps us see that the second statement here is indeed the conclusion of this argument. So what's the takeaway from this video? Well, if you've ever used the why because test, but you've found that sometimes it doesn't seem to work in helping you identify conclusions, then remember that what you should be asking is, why should I believe this statement is true? How do I know that it's true? What should make me think that it's true? You should not be asking why in its explanatory sense. You should not be thinking, what explains why this statement is true? How did the fact in this statement come to be? That's the wrong sense of why when you're trying to figure out what's a conclusion and what's a premise.